Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on the throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king was the white rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get the trial done, she thought, and hand round the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. "That's the judge," she said to herself, "because of his great wig." The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore his crown over the wig, look at the frontispiece if you want to see how he did it, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. "And that's the jury box," thought Alice. "And those 12 creatures," she was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some were birds, "I suppose they are the jurors." She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself. Jurors, jurors, being rather proud of it, for she thought, and rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the Gryphon. "They can't have anything to put down yet before the trial's begun." "They're putting down their names," the Gryphon whispered in reply, "for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Stupid things!" Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but she stopped herself hastily, for the white rabbit cried out, "Silence in the court!" And the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously round to make out who was talking. Alice could see as well as if she were looking over their shoulders that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbour to tell him, how do you spell stupid? A nice muddle their slates will be in before the trial's over, thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, it was Bill, the lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it, so after hunting all about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate. "Harold, read the accusation," said the king. On this, the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll, and read as follows. The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away. "Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury. "Oh, not yet, not yet," the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "Call the first witness," said the king, and the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and called out, "First witness." The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. I beg your pardon, your majesty," he began, "for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "You ought to have finished," said the king. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the courtroom arm in arm with the Dormouse. "The 14th of March, I think it was," he said. "15th, said the March Hare. "16th, added the Dormouse. Write that down," the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answers to shillings and pence. "Take off your hat," the king said to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "Stolen!" the king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact.
"I keep them to sell," the Hatter added as an explanation. "I've none of my own. I'm a hatter."
Here the Queen put on her spectacles and began staring hard at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. "Give your evidence," said the King, "and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the Queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court, but on second thought she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her.
"I wish you wouldn't squeeze so," said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe."
"I can't help it," said Alice very meekly. "I'm growing."
"You've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse.
"Don't talk nonsense," Alice said more boldly. "You know you're growing too."
"Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace," said the Dormouse. "Not in that ridiculous fashion."
And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the Queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court she said to one of the officers of the court,
"Bring me the list of the singers in the last concert."
On which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook off both his shoes. "Give your evidence," the King repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed whether you are nervous or not."
I'm a poor man, Your Majesty," the Hatter began in a trembling voice, and I hadn't begun my tea, not above a week or so. And what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea—"
"The twinkling of what?" said the King.
"Well, it began with the tea," the Hatter replied.
"Of course twinkling begins with a T," said the King sharply. "Do you take me for a dunce? Go on."
I'm a poor man," the Hatter went on, and most things twinkled after that. Only the March Hare said—"
"I didn't," the March Hare interrupted in a great hurry.
"You did," said the Hatter.
"I deny it," said the March Hare. "He denies it," said the King. "Leave out that part."
"Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said—"
the Hatter went on, looking anxiously round to see if he would deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep.
"After that," continued the Hatter, "I cut some more bread and butter."
"But what did the Dormouse say?"
one of the jury asked.
"Well, that I can't remember,"
said the Hatter. "You must remember," remarked the King, "or I'll have you executed." The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee.
"I'm a poor man, Your Majesty," he began.
"You're a very poor speaker," said the King. Here one of the guinea pigs cheered, and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. As that is rather a hard word, I will just explain to you how it was done. They had a large canvas bag which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig head first, and then sat upon it. "I'm glad I've seen that done," thought Alice. "I've so often read in the newspapers at the end of trials there was some attempt at applause which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court, and I never understood what it meant till now." "If that's all you know about it, you may stand down," continued the King.
"I can't go no lower," said the Hatter. "I'm on the floor as it is."
"Then you may sit down," the King replied. Here the other guinea pig cheered, and was suppressed.
"Come, that finishes the guinea pigs," thought Alice. "Now we shall get on better."
"I'd rather finish my tea,"
said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the Queen, who was reading the list of singers. "Oh, you may go," said the King, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court without even waiting to put his shoes on.
"And just take his head off outside,"
the Queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. "Call the next witness," said the King. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was even before she got into the court by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once. "Give your evidence," said the King.
"Shut,"
said the cook. The King looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness. Well, if I must, I must, the king said with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice, "What are tarts made of?" "Pepper, mostly," said the cook. "Treacle," said a sleepy voice behind her.
Call us that dormouse!
The queen shrieked out.
Behead that dormouse! Throw that dormouse out of court! Surprise him! Pinch him! Off with his whiskers!
For some minutes the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. "Never mind," said the king with an air of great relief. "Call the next witness." And he added in an undertone to the queen, "Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache." Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. "For they haven't got much evidence yet," she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name
Alice!
Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence.
Here!
cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below, and there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon!" she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other." As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. "What do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatever?" persisted the king. "Nothing whatever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, Your Majesty means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke. Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone. "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if he were trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote it down important and some unimportant. Alice could see this, as she was near enough to look over their slates. "But it doesn't matter a bit," she thought to herself. At this moment the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read out from his book, "Rule 42, all persons more than a mile high to leave the court." Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. Consider your verdict, he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice.
There's more evidence to come yet. Please, Your Majesty, said the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. This paper has just been picked up.
What's in it?
Said the Queen. I haven't opened it yet, said the White Rabbit, but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody.
Well, it must have been that, said the King, unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know.
Who is it directed to?
Said one of the jurymen. It isn't directed at all, said the White Rabbit. In fact, there is nothing written on the outside. He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, Oh, it isn't a letter, after all. It's a set of verses.
Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?
Asked another of the jurymen. No, they're not, said the White Rabbit, and that's the queerest thing about it. The jury all looked puzzled.
He must have imitated somebody else's hand,
said the King. The jury all brightened up again.
Please, Your Majesty, said the knave. I didn't write it, and I can't prove that I did. There's no name signed at the end.
If you didn't sign it, said the King, that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man.
There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the King had said that day.
That proves his guilt, of course,
said the Queen.
So off with it.
It doesn't prove anything of the sort, said Alice. Why, you don't even know what they're about.
Read them,
said the King. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin? Please, Your Majesty, he asked.
Begin at the beginning,
the King said very gravely,
and go on till you come to the end. Then stop.
There was dead silence in the court, whilst the White Rabbit read out these verses. They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone, we know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free exactly as they were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me.
That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet, said the King, rubbing his hands. So now let the jury...
If any one of them can explain it, said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. I'll give him 6pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. The jury all wrote down on their slates, she doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it, but none of them attempted to explain the paper.
Well, there's no meaning in it, said the King. That saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet, I don't know.
He went on, spreading out the verses on his knee and looking at them with one eye.
I seem to see some meaning in them, after all. It said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?
He added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly.
Do I look like it?
He said. Which he certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard.
All right, so far,
said the King, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself.
Well, I think somewhere else we know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. If she should push the matter on, that must be the Queen. What would become of you? What indeed? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know.
"But it goes on. They all return from him to you," said Alice. "Well, yes, that is why there they are," said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. "Well, nothing can be clearer than that." And then again, before she had this fit. You never had fits, my dear, I think, he said to the Queen. "Never!" said the Queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with one finger as he found it made no mark, but he now hastily began again, using the ink that was trickling down his face as long as it lasted. "Well, then, the words don't fit you," said the king, looking round the court with a smile. There was dead silence. "It's a pun," the king added in an angry tone, and everybody laughed. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the king said, for about the 20th time that day. "No! No!" said the Queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." "Stuff and nonsense," said Alice loudly. "The idea of having the sentence first." "Hold your tongue," said the Queen, turning purple. "I won't," said Alice. "Off with her head!" the Queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. "Who cares for you?" said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. "Wake up, Alice, dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice. And she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all these strange adventures of hers that you have just been reading about. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly, but now run into your tea. It's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still, just as she'd left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion, and this was her dream. First she dreamed about little Alice herself. Once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers. She could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that queer little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still, as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place round her became alive with the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighbouring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the Queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed around it. Once more the shriek of the griffin, the squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sob of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on, with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would be only rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the griffin, and all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamour of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright
and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days.
Cadman presents Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There by Lewis Carroll, performed by Christopher Plummer.
Child of the pure, unclouded brow, and dreaming eyes of wonder, though time be fleet, and I and thou are half a life asunder, thy loving smile will surely hail the love-gift of a fairy tale. I have not seen thy sunny face, nor heard thy silver laughter. No thought of me shall find a place in thy young life's hereafter. Enough that now thou wilt not fail to listen to my fairy tale. A tale begun in other days, when summer suns were glowing, a simple chime that served to time the rhythm of our rowing, whose echoes live in memory yet, though envious years would say, forget. Come hearken then, ere voice of dread with bitter tidings laden shall summon to unwelcome bed a melancholy maiden. We are but older children, dear, who fret to find our bedtime near. Without the frost, the blinding snow, the storm wind's moody madness, within the firelight's ruddy glow, and childhood's nest of gladness, the magic words shall hold thee fast. Thou shalt not heed the raving blast. And though the shadow of a sigh may tremble through the story, for happy summer days gone by, and vanished summer glory, it shall not touch with breath of bale the pleasance of our fairy tale.
One thing was certain, that the white kitten had had nothing to do with it. It was the black kitten's fault entirely. For the white kitten had been having its face washed by the old cat for the last quarter of an hour, and bearing it pretty well, considering. So you see that it couldn't have had any hand in the mischief. The way Dinah washed her children's faces was this. First, she held the poor thing down by its ear with one paw, and then with the other paw she rubbed its face all over the wrong way, beginning at the nose. And just now, as I said, she was hard at work on the white kitten, which was lying quite still and trying to purr, no doubt feeling that it was all meant for its good. But the black kitten had been finished with earlier in the afternoon, and so, while Alice was sitting curled up in the corner of the great armchair, half talking to herself and half asleep, the kitten had been having a grand game of romps with the ball of worsted Alice had been trying to wind up, and had been rolling it up and down till it had all come undone again, and there it was, spread over the hearthrug, all knots and tangles, with the kitten running after its own tail in the middle. "Oh, you wicked, wicked little thing!" cried Alice, catching up the kitten and giving it a little kiss to make it understand that it was in disgrace. "Really, Dinah ought to have taught you better manners. You ought, Dinah, you know you ought," she added, looking reproachfully at the old cat and speaking in as cross a voice as she could manage. And then she scrambled back into the armchair, taking the kitten and the worsted with her, and began winding up the ball again. But she didn't get on very fast, as she was talking all the time, sometimes to the kitten and sometimes to herself. Kitty sat very demurely on her knee, pretending to watch the progress of the winding, and now and then putting out one paw and gently touching the ball, as if it would be glad to help if it might. "Do you know what tomorrow is, Kitty?" Alice began. "You'd have guessed it if you'd been up in the window with me, only Dinah was making you tidy, so you couldn't. I was watching the boys getting in sticks for the bonfire,
and it wants plenty of sticks, Kitty. Only it got so cold, and it snowed so they had to leave off. Never mind, Kitty, we'll go and see the bonfire tomorrow. Here Alice wound 2 or 3 turns of the worsted round the kitten's neck just to see how it would look. This led to a scramble in which the ball rolled down upon the floor, and yards of it got unwound again. "Do you know, I was so angry, Kitty," Alice went on as soon as they were comfortably settled again. "When I saw all the mischief you had been doing, I was very nearly opening the window and putting you out into the snow, and you'd have deserved it, you little mischievous darling. What have you got to say for yourself? Now, don't interrupt me," she went on, holding up one finger. "I'm going to tell you all your faults. Number 1, you squeaked twice while Dinah was washing your face this morning. Now, you can't deny it, Kitty. I heard you. What's that you say?" Pretending that the kitten was speaking. "Her paw went into your eye? Well, that's your fault for keeping your eyes open. If you'd shut them tight up, it wouldn't have happened. Now, don't make any more excuses, but listen. Number 2, you pulled Snowdrop away by the tail just as I had put down the saucer of milk before her. What? You were thirsty, were you? Well, how do you know she wasn't thirsty too? Now for number 3, you unwound every bit of the worsted while I wasn't looking. That's 3 faults, Kitty, and you've not been punished for any of them yet. You know I'm saving up all your punishments for Wednesday week." "Suppose they'd saved up all my punishments," she went on, talking more to herself than the kitten. "What would they do at the end of the year? I should be sent to prison, I suppose, when the day came. Or, let me see, suppose each punishment was to be going without a dinner. Then when the miserable day came, I should have to go without 50 dinners at once. Well, I shouldn't mind that much. I'd far rather go without them than eat them. Do you hear the snow against the window panes, Kitty? How nice and soft it sounds, just as if someone was kissing the window all over outside. I wonder if the snow loves the trees and fields that it kisses them so gently, and then it covers them up snug, you know, with a white quilt, and perhaps it says, 'Go to sleep, darlings,' till the summer comes again. And when they wake up in the summer, Kitty, they dress themselves all in green and dance about whenever the wind blows. Oh, that's very pretty," cried Alice, dropping the ball of worsted to clap her hands. "And I do so wish it was true. I'm sure the woods look sleepy in the autumn and the leaves are getting brown. Kitty, can you play chess? Now, don't smile, my dear. I'm asking it seriously, because when we were playing just now, you watched just as if you understood it, and when I said check, you purred. Well, it was a nice check, Kitty, and really I might have won if it hadn't been for that nasty knight that came wriggling down among my pieces. Kitty, dear, let's pretend." And here I wish I could tell you half the things Alice used to say, beginning with her favourite phrase, "let's pretend." She had had quite a long argument with her sister only the day before, all because Alice had begun with, "Let's pretend we're kings and queens," and her sister, who liked being very exact, had argued that they couldn't because there were only 2 of them, and Alice had been reduced at last to say, "Well, you can be one of them then, and I'll be all the rest." And once she had really frightened her old nurse by shouting suddenly in her ear, "Nurse, do let's pretend that I'm a hungry hyena, and you're a bone." But this is taking us away from Alice's speech to the kitten. "Let's pretend that you're the Red Queen, Kitty. Do you know, I think if you sat up and folded your arms, you'd look exactly like her. Now do try. There's a dear." And Alice got the Red Queen off the table and set it up before the kitten as a model for it to imitate. However, the thing didn't succeed, principally, Alice said, because the kitten wouldn't fold its arms properly. So to punish it, she held it up to the looking-glass that it might see how sulky it was. "And if you're not good directly," she added, "I'll put you through into Looking-Glass House. How would you like that?" "Now, if you'll only attend, Kitty, and not talk so much, I'll tell you all my ideas about Looking-Glass House. First, there's the room you can see through the glass. That's just the same as our drawing room, only the things go the other way. I can see all of it when I get upon a chair, all but the bit just behind the fireplace. Oh, I do so wish I could see that bit. I want so much to know whether they've a fire in the winter. You never can tell, you know, unless our fire smokes, and then smoke comes up in that room too. But That may be only pretense, just to make it look as if they had a fire. Well, then the books are something like our books, only the words go the wrong way. I know that, because I've held up one of our books to the glass, and then they hold up one in the other room. How would you like to live in Looking Glass House, Kitty? I wonder if they'd give you milk in there. Perhaps Looking Glass milk isn't good to drink. But, oh, Kitty, now we come to the passage. You can just see a little peep of the passage in Looking Glass House if you leave the door of our drawing room wide open, and it's very like our passage as far as you can see, only you know it may be quite different on beyond. Oh, Kitty, how nice it would be if we could only get through into Looking Glass House. I'm sure it's got such beautiful things in it. Let's pretend there's a way of getting through into it somehow, Kitty. Let's pretend the glass has got all soft like gauze, so that we can get through. Why, it's turning into a sort of mist now, I declare. It'll be easy enough to get through. She was up on the chimney-piece while she said this, though she hardly knew how she had got there. And certainly the glass was beginning to melt away, just like a bright silvery mist. In another moment, Alice was through the glass and had jumped lightly down into the looking-glass room. The very first thing she did was to look whether there was a fire in the fireplace, and she was quite pleased to find that there was, a real one, blazing away as brightly as the one she had left behind. So I shall be as warm here as I was in the old room, thought Alice. Warmer, in fact, because there'll be no one here to scold me away from the fire. Oh, what fun it'll be when they see me through the glass in here and can't get at me. Then she began looking about, and noticed that what could be seen from the old room was quite common and uninteresting, but that all the rest was as different as possible. For instance, the pictures on the wall next the fire seemed to be all alive, and the very clock on the chimney-piece, you know you can only see the back of it in the looking-glass, had got the face of a little old man and grinned at her. They don't keep this room as tidy as the other, Alice thought to herself as she noticed several of the chessmen down in the hearth among the cinders. But in another moment, with a little of surprise, she was down on her hands and knees watching them. The chessmen were walking about, 2 and 2. Here are the Red King and the Red Queen, Alice said in a whisper for fear of frightening them. And there are the White King and the White Queen, sitting on the edge of the shovel. And here are 2 castles walking arm in arm. I don't think they can hear me, she went on as she put her head closer down. And I'm nearly sure they can't see me. I feel somehow as if I was getting invisible. Here something began squeaking on the table behind Alice, and made her turn her head just in time to see one of the white pawns roll over and begin kicking. She watched it with great curiosity to see what would happen next.
It is the voice of my child!
The White Queen cried out as she rushed past the king so violently that she knocked him over among the cinders.
My precious Lily! My imperial kitten! Oh!
And she began scrambling wildly up the side of the fender.
Imperial fiddlestick!
Said the king, rubbing his nose, which had been hurt by the fall. He had a right to be a little annoyed with the queen, for he was covered with ashes from head to foot. Alice was very anxious to be of use, and as the poor little Lily was nearly screaming herself into a fit, she hastily picked up the queen and set her on the table by the side of her noisy little daughter. The queen gasped and sat down. The rapid journey through the air had quite taken away her breath, and for a minute or two she could do nothing but hug the little Lily in silence. As soon as she had recovered her breath a little, she called out to the White King, who was sitting sulkily among the ashes.
Mind the volcano! What volcano?
Said the king, looking up anxiously into the fire, as if he thought that was the most likely place to find one.
Oh, blew me up!
Panted the queen, who was still a little out of breath.
Mind you come up the regular way! Don't get blown up!
Alice watched the White King as he slowly struggled up from bar to bar, till at last she said, "Why, you'll be hours and hours getting to the table at that rate. I'd far better help you, hadn't I?" But the king took no notice of the question. It was quite clear that he could neither hear her nor see her. So Alice picked him up very gently and lifted him across more slowly than she had lifted the queen, that she mightn't take his breath away. But before she put him on the table, she thought she might as well dust him a little. He was so covered with ashes. She said afterwards that she had never seen in all her life such a face as the king made when he found himself held in the air by an invisible hand and being dusted. He was far too much astonished to cry out, but his eyes and his mouth went on getting larger and larger and rounder, till her hand shook so with laughing that she nearly let him drop upon the floor. "Oh, please don't make such faces, my dear," she cried out, quite forgetting that the king couldn't hear her. "You make me laugh so that I can hardly hold you. And don't keep your mouth so wide open. All the ashes will get into it. There now, I think you're tidy enough," she added as she smoothed his hair and set him upon the table near the queen. The king immediately fell flat on his back and lay perfectly still. And Alice was a little alarmed at what she had done, and went round the room to see if she could find any water to throw over him. However, she could find nothing but a bottle of ink, and when she got back with it, she found he had recovered, and he and the queen were talking together in a frightened whisper, so low that Alice could hardly hear what they said. The king was saying,
"I assure you, my dear, I turn cold to the very ends of my whiskers."
To which the queen replied,
"But you haven't got any whiskers."
"The horror of that moment,"
the king went on,
"I shall never forget."
"You will, though," the queen said, "if you don't make a memorandum of it." Alice looked on with great interest as the king took an enormous memorandum book out of his pocket and began writing. A sudden thought struck her, and she took hold of the end of the pencil, which came some way over his shoulder, and began writing for him. The poor king looked puzzled and unhappy, and struggled with the pencil for some time without saying anything, but Alice was too strong for him, and at last he panted out,
"Oh, my dear, I really must get a thinner pencil. I can't manage this one a bit. It writes all manner of things that I don't intend."
"What manner of things?"
said the queen, looking over the book in which Alice had put, "The White Knight is sliding down the poker. He balances very badly."
Oh, that's not a memorandum of your feelings. Oh.
There was a book lying near Alice on the table, and while she sat watching the White King, for she was still a little anxious about him and had the ink all ready to throw over him in case he fainted again, she turned over the leaves to find some part that she could read. "For it's all in some language I don't know," she said to herself. It was like this. She puzzled over this for some time, but at last a bright thought struck her.
Why, it's a looking-glass book, of course. And if I hold it up to a glass, the words will all go the right way again.
This was the poem that Alice read. Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borough groves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jub-Jub bird, and shun the fruminous Bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the Tum-Tum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh, Calais, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borough groves, and the moonbraths outgrabe.
"It seems very pretty,"
she said when she'd finished it.
"but it's rather hard to understand."
You see, she didn't like to confess even to herself that she couldn't make it out at all.
"Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't exactly know what they are. However, somebody killed something. That's clear at any rate. But, oh," thought Alice, suddenly jumping up, "if I don't make haste, I shall have to go back through the looking-glass before I've seen what the rest of the house is like. Let's have a look at the garden first." She was out of the room in a moment and ran downstairs, or at least it wasn't exactly running, but a new invention for getting downstairs quickly and easily, as Alice said to herself. She just kept the tips of her fingers on the handrail and floated gently down without even touching the stairs with her feet. Then she floated on through the hall and would have gone straight out at the door in the same way if she hadn't caught hold of the doorpost. She was getting a little giddy with so much floating in the air, and was rather glad to find herself walking again in the natural way.